Hi, I'm Brian Katsoulis. I'm a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy here at the Middle East Institute. Sabah al-khair to all of you joining from America. Masal al-khair for those of you in the Middle East. We're really glad that you joined this special program looking at the Arab American vote in the elections here in the United States. Before I introduce the panel and the discussion, I want to highlight some things that we have out on the web and some things in the pipeline. Just this morning, we released our latest version of the Harris-Trump tracker on Middle East positions. What we've looked at for the last 3 or 4 months is how the two major candidates have staked out their positions on issues like Palestine, Israel, Iran, Syria. You can check it out. It's a great resource. You can find it at www.mei.edu or .edu. We also have 2 initiatives this fall, one looking at Iran and what a new day in Iran might look like in terms of US policy, as well as the region and the people of Iran, and then a second initiative that's examining the possibilities for a state of Palestine in the Arab-Israel sets of issues. But today, we're really lucky to have an excellent panel of experts join us to talk about these elections. And I want to highlight one thing because we are nonpartisan and avowedly so here at the Middle East Institute. We're a nonprofit in C3. Our mission is about education and trying to inform the debate. This is not a political discussion in the sense that this candidate is better than that candidate. This is an analytical discussion about the politics of this and the politics of the Middle East as it affects the Arab American community, which has been growing in voice and in action in terms of trying to lift up its voice on the range of Middle East policy issues for years, and then most acutely during this horrific war over the last year in Gaza that's now expanded to Lebanon. And today we have an excellent panel that's going to discuss the results of a poll conducted by YouGov and Arab News. The genesis for this panel was our friends at Arab News said, hey, Brian, we have this poll, and it would be really interesting to talk with some various audiences about it. And I said, why don't we do a webinar? And that's what we're doing here. So let me introduce the speakers in order of introductory remarks first, and then we're going to have a conversation. If you want to join the conversation, make a point, ask a question, do so in the chat function. I'll be monitoring that along with my colleagues, and we want to draw your voice into it. We're going to talk for about half an hour and then have Q&A for about 45 minutes. First speaking will be Tariq El-Ahmed, who's the head of research and studies at Arab News. He'll be talking about the poll results, along with Lara Barazi, who is a freelance data consultant and a former research director at YouGov, which was a partner to Arab News. Third, I'm lucky to turn the tables on Yasmin Abu Talib, who sometimes calls me about some of her reporting, which is quite excellent, not just from the White House, but from this campaign, and in particular, some recent articles about how Arab American and Muslim American voters are viewing the debate these days in Michigan. And her most recent piece on that was out, I believe, last Thursday or Friday. Check it out online there. And then last but not least, and I've been reading and learning from this gentleman for many years, his reporting and his analysis, and was recently on his program. And I'm honored to return the favor to have you here at MEI, is Ray Hanania, who's the senior US correspondent for Arab News. So let's hear first from Tariq, have some perspectives about this complicated topic, and we'll move from there. Thanks again for joining. Tariq, over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for tuning in and for hosting us here. I'm honored to be speaking among our esteemed panelists here. So yes, we're really 10 days away from this election, and it's a nail biter. And our YouGov poll has really seen a lot of different aspects of what's to come. What are really some like key findings that we found were actually the fact that we have a record high of 9 in 10 people from the respondents going into vote. So that's almost 90% turnout. This is essentially very much higher than it was back in 2016 when it was, back in 2020 when it was at 79%, and back in 2016 when it was at 68%. Now there's a 2% margin for voting for Trump. So there's a 45% people looking at voting for Trump, while 43% voting for Harris. Now, these are not really as surprising given that what we're seeing in the news these days, but big things to look at are the foreign policy aspects of our poll. Within the poll, we really asked our respondents, okay, what is your biggest priority when it comes to voting or casting your vote to the ballot? And most of the respondents found that the Palestine-Israel conflict is, as a whole, the most prioritized thing, an item on the docket. Now, this is especially surprising because 69% of those who responded to our survey actually found that Trump is closer to the Israeli government, while also mostly finding that he is more likely to solve the U.S. election, the Palestine-Israeli conflict. So this shows a kind of strange aspect of this person's with or this person's against. Now, Arab Americans, and I'm sure my esteemed colleagues in the US can speak more about this, is the fact that Arab Americans need to balance between the foreign policy aspect of what's going on back in their ancestral homes, as well as what's going on in their current homes and what's going on the ground, which means domestic issues such as hate crime or jobs or economy or cost of living are very important to this. Now, obviously, as we've seen, the Arab American community is not as big or as strong as the Black community or the Latino community. Now, while this doesn't seem that important on a national scale, as we can see, they do come out in numbers when it comes to the swing states, such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, Chicago, etc. So as a whole, it's kind of a balance between what Arab Americans want for the long run inside the country, as well as what they feel like what should happen across and outside, back at home, back at their ancestral homes. Now, I'll turn the tables to Lara, our colleague, who can speak more about the detail of the findings when it comes to the methodology and such. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks for having me on this panel. I'm just going to give you some background on the study we're discussing through this panel. So obviously, this study was commissioned by Arab News to better understand the Arab American voice and their take on the coming US elections. The survey was conducted by YouGov using their online panel in the US. Important things to highlight is the fieldwork dates. It started on September 26th and it ended on October 1st. So just after the war on Lebanon had started and just before the 1-year mark on the war on Gaza. So these are important things to keep in mind when we look at the data that we will discuss. In terms of sample size, we captured a sample of 500 Arab Americans across the US. It has been weighted by various demographics like age, gender, race, education, and region. And this was based on a subset, Arab American subset, based on the 2022 American Community Survey. And the margin of error is about 5.93%. These are the technical parts of the survey that we are discussing. As Tariq said, that one of the most important insights out of the survey is the high turnout. So 87% mentioned that they will go and vote in November. What's interesting when we look in terms of gender, so 92% of men, for example, said that they will vote versus 81% of women. When it comes to age groups, the youngest, 18 to 34 years old, said that 84% that they would vote versus the oldest, or 55 years of age and plus, which is 90%. So you've got 84% versus 90%. So this is very important because, I mean, when we look at this age group, the 55 years, the mature, the experienced one, they have a high probability of going in to vote. When we look into party affiliations, 95% of those who said that were Democrats will vote versus 97% of Republicans. The lowest turnout is from the independents, 77%. Overall, 8 in 10 Arab Americans said that they believe that their votes matter. And this is very important as well, especially for those who live in the Northeast. You've got 90% who said that they believe that their votes matter. When it comes to the candidates, obviously, Tariq said that it's a very tight race. Even amongst Arab Americans, you've got Donald Trump, who got 45%, versus Harris, who got 43% at the moment, based on our data. It varies between demographics. So you've got, for example, Donald Trump, he's got more support from men, 48% of men said they will vote for him versus 41% of women. He's got most of the support from the Northeast, 48%, while Harris got most of her support from the West. And the highest support of Harris comes from the oldest, so anyone who is 55 years of age and more. What's really interesting, and I thought we should highlight it, is that Donald Trump lures more Democrat votes more than Harris get Republican votes. So we've got 24% of Democrats who said they will vote for Donald Trump versus 11% of Republicans who would vote for Harris. So you've got this very strong base of Republicans who would definitely vote for Trump, while Democrats is a bit, weaker. In terms of when it comes to the third candidate, I think we should highlight that based on our sample, Jill Stein got only 4%. The highest support she got was from the Midwest, which is 13%. 13% of the Midwest said that they will vote for Jill Stein. 6% are still undecided. In terms of the highest priority in terms of issues that Arab American face, we did mention Palestinian-Israeli conflict that came at 29%, the highest, then followed by economy and cost of living. But what's more interesting is when we look at those different variables within our sample, we see that the highest amongst for Palestinian, the highest support for Palestinian-Israeli conflict comes from independents, and lowest comes from Republicans. So only 17% of Republicans said that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a top priority for us, while cost of living comes the highest for Republicans. So these are issues that kind of mirror what's going on right now in the US, not only for Arab Americans. In terms of when we look at income, and it's something that we mentioned before, is we look at the lowest earners, the highest priority goes to Palestinian conflict. Just 41% of the lowest earners support the Palestinian-Israeli conflict versus highest earner. Basically, they're interested in economy, cost of living, and Palestinian conflict, but they do put a lot of weight on the economy and cost of living. So these are important things I thought I'd highlight before we go deeper into analyzing the rest of the data.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura, and thanks to both you and Tarek for doing this poll and then offering some of the initial top lines on it. I want to turn to Yasmin, basically with two questions. And one, I already mentioned your terrific reporting, but the first question, you've seen the poll results. Your latest report actually cites it. The first question, is there anything that's surprising to you about the numbers, or does it match with what you've seen in your reporting trips? And then second, I thought maybe you could spend a few minutes. The thing that I've really found great about your reporting is that you give the human side of things, the element. Yes, you talk to mayors like Abdallah Hammoud from Dearborn, but then you talk about their story and their lives, and how he shows you the photos from his hometown in Lebanon and the devastation and destruction, or that his wife's grandmother's funeral they were not able to attend because of the violence. Maybe tell us a little bit about, beyond the numbers, what you've seen in your repeated reporting trips to Michigan and getting outside of the DC bubble.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian, and thanks to all the panelists as well, and for the great poll, which did help inform our latest reporting. I actually was surprised by the poll results because when I've talked to Arab American and Muslim voters throughout the year, so I started going to Michigan in January when I sort of saw the initial forming of the Abandon Biden movement and the Uncommitted movement in Michigan, these protest votes to signal to Biden when he was the candidate that he was going to lose the support of this critical community if he did not dramatically change course on US military support of Israel and what he was doing in Gaza. But when I've gone, I have not heard a ton of support for Trump. What I've heard when I talk to people that motivates their vote, whether it's for Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, who's polling at about 1% in Michigan, but according to Tadek and Lars poll, much higher among the Arab American and Muslim community, is they're trying to punish the Democrats. This is a community that has historically supported the Democrats in really high numbers. About 80% of Arab Americans and Muslims in Michigan supported Biden, traditionally support Democrats up and down the ballot. And that's obviously not going to be the case this year if the trends that we've been seeing and the reporting that we've been doing holds, which is, I think, quite dramatic in a state like Michigan. It's worth stating that this race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is historically close. So every margin counts. And I think you can tell how important the state is and how important every last voter is just looking at their travel schedules. So I went to Michigan about a week and a half ago for a couple of days. And while I was there, that week, Kamala Harris visited the state 3 separate times. In 1 week, she did 5 campaign stops. And one of the days I was there, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump visited the state, and they both made direct overtures to the Arab American and Muslim community, which I don't think we've seen in recent elections, where candidates are thinking so much about this voter group. And I think one of the remarkable things is I cover Kamala Harris's campaign, so I'm in touch with them much more than I am with Donald Trump's campaign. And they'll send me, different people on the campaign will send me these texts reminding me of, what they think are the incendiary things Trump has said about the Arab American and Muslim community, like making sure we see it, making sure we report it, because they think the contrast between the candidates is stark, but they know that they're really struggling with this voter group. And it is something that they're deeply worried about, because if they don't win Michigan, it's going to be very hard for them to win the presidency. And so what I found when I've gone to Michigan, when I went a couple of times when Biden was the candidate, I found a community that was pretty united. They maybe were going to cast their votes differently. Some people were going to abstain from the presidential race. Some people would have voted for Jill Stein. Some people would have written something in. Maybe some people would cast a vote for Trump. But they were united in the idea that they were not going to support Biden. And I think, obviously he is the president, it's his policy, connect Biden directly with what's happening. And also not just that, it's the way Biden speaks about Israelis versus Palestinians that I think informs a lot of how people view him versus Kamala Harris. I've written before about how a lot of not just Arab Americans and Muslims, but progressives and Democrats feel he does not express sufficient empathy to Palestinians. He talks about the October 7th attacks in really visceral, sort of graphic terms, but he doesn't do the same when it comes to what's happened in Gaza and now what's happening in Lebanon. And people notice these things. I mean, I think the other thing is that people tend to write off single issue voters or write them off thinking they're sort of simplistic. And I have not found that to be the case at all. They pay very close attention to everything that's said. They pay attention to every weapons shipment. And they don't buy into rhetoric anymore. I think that's the biggest thing. They're deeply skeptical of all the candidates, and they're not really a huge fan of any of the candidates on the ballot. I mean, when I've spoken to people in Michigan, so when I went back this most recent time, I wanted to see what the debate was like with Kamala Harris versus Joe Biden, and people were much more torn. I think, the stakes of this election have become much more real now that we're just 9 days out, 8 or 9 days out. Donald Trump has said things about the enemy from within and jailing dissidents and mass deportations. And so the threats, I think, of a Donald Trump presidency are becoming more real for people. But at the same time, people say, look, at least the people I've spoken to, I don't want him to win, but I can't bring myself to vote for someone who, in my view, has condoned or enabled the killing of my friends and family. And I thought Abdullah Mahmoud, the Dearborn mayor, summed it up really nicely, where he said the moral quandary people are having is, if I vote for this candidate or that candidate, whoever it is, am I going to be able to sleep at night if this slaughter continues and I voted for the person who continued it? And obviously with Donald Trump, I think one of the reasons I was surprised about the level of support for him in the poll is because he was very pro-Israel as president and has vowed to be very pro-Israel in a second term. He obviously moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He allowed Israel to annex the Golan Heights. But I think, people are grieving and they're very angry. And there's been 4 years since the last Donald Trump term. And so I think there is, in some cases, a little bit of fogginess over what he did or what he's saying he'll do versus what his actions have shown he will most likely do. I wasn't part of this story, but my colleagues reported on Friday that he recently held a call with Benjamin Netanyahu where he expressed support for the offensives in Gaza and Lebanon, especially the pager operation, and vowed to continue supporting him as president. So I think these are all important things people need to know before they make their decision. But what I found when I was in Michigan was when people talked about voting for Jill Stein or for Donald Trump or whoever it was more about, I need to send the Democrats a message than it was about really, strong support for that specific candidate.
Great. Thanks so much, Yasmin. And I'll circle back to some of the points you've all made here, but I want to turn to Ray, because Ray, you've seen many different election cycles, and you've analyzed the Arab American community over that period of time, as well as U.S. policy. What do you think is different about 2024 when you look at the shape of things and everything that Tarek and Lara and Yasmin discussed here? How do you take a look at what we're experiencing here this year and what's to come in the next week or so with these elections?
Well, as you know, I started covering politics in 1976 in Chicago, which is like where politics is really the only sport.
Yeah.
So, and then I worked with people growing up, including Ibrahim Abulud and Edward Said. I knew them. I was at meetings, so I had a real strong feeling about Arabs and Arabs in politics and voting. The one thing I've learned is that presidential elections are not won by the popular vote across the country. So these pictures of popular vote really, they have meaning in the bigger picture, but when you have a close contest where there are 5 or 6 swing votes, swing states, that are going to be influenced by the election, those constituencies, you can identify them in those swing states. For the first time, Arab voters are significant in the states where the swing states are going to make a difference. So their vote is augmented far more than it has been in prior elections. So like in Michigan, with the Electoral College vote, Biden barely won Michigan in 2020, and they can make the difference. And all Trump needs, for example, would be to win 3 of those states to turn this election around, especially now that the polls show across the country that the 2 candidates are neck and neck. That gives the Arab vote and the Arab and Muslim vote significant leverage, I think, in this election. And I think we'll see. When I get polled, people call me and they ask me, who you're going to vote for. One, I never tell the truth. I'll be honest with you. I'm not going to be honest. I'm going to lie. I don't know who's calling me in today's world. And I think that and I think Yasmin described it pretty well. There's actually 2 races going on. One is, who do you want to be president, Trump or Harris? And then the other one is more of a principle. Do I make a statement that's going to send a message to the Democratic Party, which I favor, but hasn't been very favorable to me? So I think that's what a lot of Arab Americans are going through, Arab voters. They're looking at that choice. But from the Arab voters and groups that I talk to, I hear more about Stein and wanting to make a statement than and they're very upset with both Harris and Trump. So I think that, she's not going to win, but I think she's going to see a surge in support coming from our community.
Great. So I want to ask you all some questions about sort of what we're experiencing here, and maybe first go back to the data, and Laura and Tarek talk a little bit more in depth about what you see in terms of what's distinctive features in the Arab American community in terms of how that compares to the general electorate. You already mentioned some of the age gaps, older Arab Americans versus younger ones. Are there similar, from what you can tell in your crosstabs, class divides, working class versus college educated, the sort of trends that we see there? And then what is distinctive besides the salience, obviously, of the wars in the Middle East and wanting something different? Is there anything else that's distinctive about this group? And I should note that quite often, sometimes polls are on Arab Americans, sometimes it's discussed in terms of Muslim Americans. There's overlap. in a loose way, but there's actually quite a lot of nuance and distinction there. So what do you think it makes this sort of community this cycle more distinctive? Laura or Tara?
Do you want me to answer? So
Yeah.
I'll go ahead with it. Essentially, what we've seen compared to last election within our own specific YouGov poll, as Lara discussed, we commissioned YouGov, and YouGov spread across the whole country to kind of go into the depths and details of either Arab Americans in Michigan and across the states. Now, the things that we found more highlight, like we didn't look into specifically gender or age gap or college educated, non-college educated. We're looking at it as a whole because the community as a whole is the one that's actually going to be making a difference. Anyway, the results have been very similar to other results done across the Arab American community, such as I believe the Arab American Institute, Zohbi's Arab American Institute's results kind of match ours. But when we want to look into like the key findings that I found very interesting across the board are the fact that this kind of balance that these Arab American communities have to do, this goes across all ages and ranges and backgrounds, is the fact that it all boils down to this identity of whether or not they, as Yasmin said, they can sleep at night because they are voting for someone who condones this kind of genocidal slaughter, or someone who we know already is a very close fan of the Israeli government, and as Yasmin has also noted, recently had essentially gave a thumbs up to Netanyahu's campaign across Lebanon and Palestine. So this aspect shows with the result of the most people looking at Palestine being the biggest factor with regards to voting. Now, back to the whole identity crisis thing with regards to being American, is looking at the fact that economy, jobs market, and cost of living all, when we combine them as their priorities, come up to a majority. So they do really care about what's going on the ground. And this also goes across all classes and across all backgrounds. So the kind of nitty-gritty is too close to call to be as drastic or as spread out and open in order to actually pinpoint as something that's of greater value. But when you look at it as a whole, which is what we're looking at specifically, we see no changes in that aspect. But Lara, if there's anything you want to add to what I said, please go ahead.
I think what I wanted to add is, I mean, in terms of voting, I mean, I did highlight the differences between some of the demographics. I only highlight the most representative or significant differences between them. Otherwise, wouldn't, especially when we consider the margin of error. But as Tariq said, having the only demographic that really mattered other than the politics is where the economy and cost of living have come up is this difference or variance between those who earn the most and those who earn the least, where economy, for example, cost of living for those who earn the least is very important for them, while we look at the highest earner is across, it's kind of spread across all those elements, so they don't really stress on a specific element. And in terms of voting, this is where basically gender might affect, or who are they going to vote for. So it seems that men are more first, they want to, the intent to vote is higher. They're more lean towards Trump than Harris. Again, the same thing goes to the oldest age groups. The intention is very high amongst them. It's one of the highest across the board. So these are elements that we really need to look at. And something that really caught my attention in the data is, and something that we don't talk about that much because we always look at the Republicans versus Democrat, but there is around 1/4 of the sample that identify themselves as independents. And this is where the intention to vote is the lowest. And I think this is a resource that if they tap into is very important, because they're still torn between, okay, what do I do? They're undecided. Their intention to vote is not that high because they don't know if their vote really matters. So this is, I think, a factor that we should look into, and I'm sure, especially in swing states, it's an important factor.
So we have a couple of really smart questions coming in from people in our community, and I'm going to try to lump them together and stay on this particular topic of trying to tease out the nuance. We've Peter Galbraith, former diplomat, asking the question, essentially, I said this briefly, but we need to remind our audiences that obviously all Arab Americans are not Muslim, and all Muslim Americans are not Arab, right? And Nada Hamada, who's on our board here at MEI, asked the question, which is, I think, beyond your survey results, but I believe you've looked at other polling, or maybe Yasmin and Ray can talk about this, is whether the attitudes of Muslim voters who aren't Arab is different, especially those from South Asia and Southeast Asian Muslims. These are very important questions. And then there's, questions that relate to the national origin of different Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, if it's Palestinian Americans versus Lebanese Americans. I assume the sample size doesn't allow you to tease all of that out, but maybe turn back to Tarek and Laura to talk a bit about this nuance in terms of whether David Welch, also on the MEI board, former diplomat, he asks whether any of the polling that you've done or you've seen break out Arab American voters in the community by religion, Christian versus Muslim and others. Just staying on this topic of nuance and complexity in this community.
Yeah, so essentially, look, this is a very good question, because this was one of the questions we asked ourselves while we were conducting the poll, before we conduct it. First of all, how do you identify as an Arab American? Does that mean you have one parent is Arab and the other doesn't have to be Arab, or do both of these people have to be Arab? Do they have to be speaking Arabic, or do they not have to be speaking Arabic? So there's a lot of ground to cover with regards to how you identify as Arab American. Now, as you said, our sample size doesn't really allow us to really get into the nitty-gritty, but we do have a kind of background of where they come from, which region and which country back in the Middle East are they from the Levant, essentially Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, and whatnot. But Lara, I believe you had a more in-depth look into these aspects.
Yeah, I mean, we do have this information for sure, where they come from, but we only go granular when there's a significant difference between those groups. So when we look, for example, at who do they vote for, or who would they like to vote for on November 5th, we didn't see that much of differences between the origin. In terms of sample size, we have enough, for example, when we look into gender, we look into age groups, we look into party affiliations. But in terms of origin, like the region where they come from, we haven't seen any major significant differences between those groups to highlight, really.
And just to add that we didn't ask regarding religion, so we do not have any information regarding specifically religion and where they come from.
Maybe I'll turn my next question, and it reflects some of the things we're getting in the chat, to both Yasmin and Ray, away from the data, but more about dynamics in the Arab American and Muslim American community, because it seems like there's much more pluralism when it comes to the different voices that are out there. I know I've seen this in your reporting, Yasmin, that different groups like Mgage taking a particular position on the candidacies and acting in ways that are different from the Arab American Political Action Committee. And then I noticed recently also some Lebanese Americans putting out a letter that had a different view. So I wonder how you could articulate for our audiences, first Yasmin and then turning to Ray, how this sort of at the political action level, political advocacy, how you see sort of the cross-cutting trends there, and if there's any sort of thing that's noteworthy in this particular cycle, and how it compares, importantly, Peter Galbraith asked in previous cycles, 2020 and 2016. First to you, Yasmin.
Well, one of the things that I found really interesting when I was reporting in Michigan, but then just more broadly, because there have been these various endorsements or non-endorsements from different groups, is just how differently people are thinking about the election and the choice in front of them. So like I said before, when it was Biden, I didn't see any Arab American or Muslim group supporting him or trying to convince people that they should support him because he was going to be better than Donald Trump. That just did not seem to be a popular view in the community, and not one anyone wanted to articulate. With Kamala Harris, it's been quite different, I think, for a couple different reasons. And I've seen it argued in different ways across MGage's endorsement. There were these sort of competing letters from different groups of imams and Muslim scholars that made very different recommendations to the community, which gets a little bit at this sort of Muslim versus Arab American versus, non-Muslim Arabs idea, because the letter from the imams was targeted to the Muslim community, not just to Arabs. And the way people are thinking about it is, there are the people like MGage, and there was this one letter from a group of about 25 imams urging people to support Kamala Harris, where they argue she's the vice president, this is not her policy, we can't hold her responsible for it. She's expressed much more empathy than Joe Biden has. She has held Israel more directly responsible in her rhetoric. But of course, the central tension here is that she has not articulated an actually distinct policy from Joe Biden if she were to become president. So she speaks about the war very differently. And you've seen her try to thread that needle where she's basically, talks about Israel's right to defend itself and against Iranian-backed proxies and all of that. But then she's also saying Palestinians have a right to self-dignity and self-determination, and she's going to pursue a two-state solution. But the balance she's trying to strike is an impossible one. She's trying to not alienate and anger pro-Israel Democrats, and she's trying to convince pro-Palestine Arab Americans, Muslims, progressives that she's going to be different without actually saying how she would be different. And so I think that's the central tension, and people often are seeing what they want to see in what she says. So you have groups like MGage and this group of imams that I mentioned who have said, look, she's spoken about it differently. She's the vice president. If she wins, we can pressure her to pursue things differently. With Donald Trump, we have no hope. There's nothing we can do. And then there was a letter from a separate group of imams and scholars, I think about 30 of them, who told people to vote third party, saying, obviously you can't support Donald Trump either. He's terrible for our community as well, but we can't support Kamala Harris. We can't support someone who's been part of an administration that's allowed and enabled this to happen. So we're urging you to vote third party so that people basically, with this third party vote, and I think Tariq and Lara both got at this, people want to lodge a protest vote. It's not because they think Jill Stein's going to vote. It's not because even in a lot of cases they think she's a great candidate. She has an anti-war message, but she's a problematic candidate in many other ways. It's because they want Democrats to see that votes that they would have gotten went to someone else because they wouldn't articulate a different policy. And that's what I've seen as the main motivation for a third party vote. So that's just sort of the range of views I've seen in terms of how people are thinking about and how community leaders are urging their constituents, people who follow them, people who listen to them, to make a decision about the election.
Great. So what people are seeing is a tone shift by Harris, but not a substance shift, and in very much she's seen as cut from the same cloth. Ray, how do you see this? And then especially this question, you mentioned a little bit of this, but compared to 2020, 2016, and we have two, one a former president and a second the current vice president. How do you think the community views this and is positioning this? And then we'll get to a series of questions about what impact we think this might have, if any, beyond Michigan. And we'll talk a bit about Michigan, but how do you see this in the recent history comparison?
Well, let me just say something about the structure of the Arab and Muslim community. Most Americans can't tell the difference between a Palestinian or a Pakistani. Our U.S. Census does a terrible job of telling us how many Arabs and Muslims there are in the United States, in spite of some of the movement that we've seen over the last few years. So we really don't know how many Arabs there are in the United States. We don't know how many Muslims there are in the United States. But if you look at when you talk about the Middle East, a lot of Muslims who are non-Arab identify with what happens to Arabs. If you look at the Muslim community, just based on what I know, the majority of Muslims are African American in this country. And the African American community has always been very close to the Palestinian and the Arab community in terms of suffering and identifying with what we go through. So there are a lot of factors that are going to influence this election. So when I talk about Arabs and Muslims, I'm really talking about a bigger vote that isn't looked at properly. American politicians don't really see us on their radar screen until there's a problem. And they don't really understand us until something like this, where the election suddenly falls on our shoulders. In Michigan and Minnesota, where there are huge Arab and Muslim populations. So if it wasn't for the fact that these two candidates were so close and that there were swing states that could flip on a dime, I'm not sure the Arab and Muslim vote would have been that significant. It wasn't that significant in 2020. I think it's going to be much more significant in this election, specifically because we're in those swing states and we feel like this is our chance to make a statement. For someone's going to listen. They're not paying attention to us as much as we want them to. That's the feeling I get from a lot of people. But I think they are paying attention to us, and I think it's going to be very significant.
Yeah,
I just want to add something. I'm sorry, Brian.
Yeah, go for it, Eric,
Based on what Ray said, and then what Ray said really does show in the results as well. The reason why there's a big turnout, as we said, 9 out of 10 Americans are set to go vote, is that 80% of those responded found that their vote actually counts and will matter in this year's election, which is, as Ray said, something that's really driving people down to the ballots because they really feel that they could actually change and make that difference, whether it is to punish the Democrats or whether it is to actually vote for an independent and showcase everything.
Great. I want to ask, I want to get to the question, the thing I think I'm all interested in, and we are here at MEI, is not the politics, but what impact it might have on policy in a little bit. But before we get there, we do have a couple of questions in the chat, and I know this seems like we're just going through little by little, but what are the panel's expectations? And maybe turn to Laura, because you've looked at the survey closely, on the state of Michigan and whether how things look for Harris versus Trump and Stein there. And then are there other swing states where, according to the research that you've all done or reporting, where it might be a factor? You just mentioned, Ray, Minnesota, but are there other places around the country, and particularly the swing states, where it might move the elections? And maybe, Yasmin, when I turn to you, how much do you think that these endorsements, whether it's from imams or from various Arab American or Muslim American mayors and people at the different political levels, how much it might matter? But maybe first to you, Laura and Tarek, about the swing state of Michigan, and are there other swing states?
I think what we've seen in terms of swing states and the significant difference is what Stein got in terms of support. The highest support she got from the Midwest, I imagine, that where Michigan is. In terms of Donald Trump, he got from the Northeast. I imagine Pennsylvania is a swing state there. He got 48% from Northeast. I mean, in terms of Harris, the highest support she got is from the West, which is normally, pro-Democrats. These are the main, differences or things that we can highlight in terms of region and swing states.
Great. So we have one question from a viewer directly to Yasmin, and it relates to sort of outcomes and in terms of how people in the communities are talking about this. Do you hear much about what a Trump administration would look like versus a Harris administration in terms of the impact on their community over the next 4 years?
I do. I mean, people are really thinking through these decisions, and I've heard some really interesting things in response to that question. I remember I spoke with one of the organizers of the Abandon Biden, now Abandon Harris movement in Michigan, who said, it's going to be devastating for us if Trump is elected, and we're going to be out in the streets protesting with everyone else, but we just can't support this. And so I think that is a really interesting way to look into how people are thinking about this. It's not, I think sometimes when people don't understand why some Arab Americans and Muslims are making this choice to support an independent candidate or not to support Harris, everyone brings up the Trump Muslim ban, Trump promising to deport all these immigrants, including legal immigrants, and just the general sort of disdain he's shown for the Arab American and Muslim community during his political career, as if people are not aware of that. They are very much aware of that. But I think Tarek made this point early in the panel where people care very deeply about what is happening in their ancestral homelands. Abdullah Mahmoud, the Dearborn mayor, did not make an endorsement. He is basically telling people to vote their conscience. And I think his endorsement actually would have moved quite a few people. If he had decided, I don't think there's a world in which he would have endorsed Trump, but if he had decided to endorse Kamala Harris, but he couldn't do that. Obviously, he spoke to me and to others about the very direct impact his family is feeling from the expansion of the war into Lebanon. Like you said, Brian, his wife and her mother could not go back for her grandmother's funeral. He has all these photos of his father's village that's been reduced to rubble. He's constantly he's going to multiple funerals a week and speaking at them. A Dearborn resident was killed in Lebanon. He was there helping displaced people. I mean, this is a really direct impact on these communities. But I think one of the things that's also been interesting to observe is the way different generations in the same family are making these decisions. And so earlier on in my reporting, I've met families who have had just dozens or more relatives killed in Gaza, just endured the absolute worst from the war. And you've seen where the parents are going to vote for Kamala Harris because they say, we live here, we're going to have to hold our nose and do it, but we can't have Trump. And the kids are not going to vote for her, kids in their 20s and 30s, because they say the Democratic Party hasn't earned their votes and they're not going to give it to them. So I think that the sort of generational divide has been interesting and to observe in some cases as well. And also to just see how people are thinking through how much they're willing to deal with the ramifications of a potential Trump presidency. And I think there is a lot of fear among Arab Americans and Muslims. I've heard this a lot throughout the year in Michigan, them saying people are going to blame us if Trump wins, but it's not our fault. It's their fault for not earning our votes.
Yeah, I've heard these comments, and I used to live in Palestine and Israel in the 1990s. And if those of you remember history, Ray gets this, is when the Israeli Arab community basically boycotted the vote after the Kfar Khan incident and the Perez government, and essentially helped usher, in part, the result was Netanyahu came to power in the first time. And there's questions about people have a right to use their vote however they choose, right? And the consequences that come after it. And I think that's an important thing. Before, Ray, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else about in terms of how this is being discussed. I wanted to ask Tarek a question about how this is being viewed from the region, because he's in the region. But do you have a point to add here, Ray?
Yeah, all I'd say is that I think that Kamala Harris has done a terrible job with her campaign in addressing Arab and Muslim voters. And I think that's, people say, well, she's only been a candidate for like 3 months or whatever. And I'm thinking, no, she still has the same advisors that were advising Biden, that come from the Obama camp, that come from the Clinton camp. They're all around her. So the same strategy that they had before is being applied now. Had they adjusted that strategy, for example, they offended many Arabs when they bought these big billboards in Philadelphia and Illinois, I think in Wisconsin and one other state, 4 states, that basically said, your vote for Jill Stein is going to give us Trump. You're responsible for Trump. I think that was offensive to a lot of Arab Americans and Muslims when they saw that, because they spent more money being punitive toward the community than they did in trying to understand what it was that we really want. I think Yasmin did a great job of explaining that. I think deep down, there's this willingness to want to protest, and express anger somehow at the polls. And this is the first time where their protest is going to have some meaning. But at the same time, I think the majority of Arabs kind of fear a Trump resurgence, but at the same time, they recognize Trump isn't just going to hurt them. Trump is going to hurt the Democrats. So maybe the Democrats should wake up and look at the Arab and Muslim community and say, hey, we can't take them for granted. We should be a little more supportive and understanding of what they say. And they have not been that way to us. Thanks
for sharing that perspective, Ray. Tarek, I wanted to shift to something maybe a little bit you weren't anticipating, but I do think it's part of at least the Washington, D.C. dialogue between policy community and between journalists and diplomats from the region. And it's this question of, do you see a preference at all coming from the region, especially from its leaders, Trump versus Harris? Or how do you think it's viewed at the both leadership level, include Israel in your response, but then at the popular level? What's the pulse? Because you and Laura have given us a snapshot of how Arab Americans, a certain slice of them here, and the voters are looking at this. How is it viewed from the region today? And is there a preference? And how are people looking at this dynamic here in America?
Well, you see, on the ground, there's a lot of different points of view, and there's no real proper preference for either candidate because of the fact that it's just such a razor thin difference. Now you have people on the ground talking about how essentially every single event that occurs causes a shift in opinion, from the entering into Lebanon, from the bombing of Iran or the targeting of Iran, to the even Biden's resignation from the nomination. So there's so many different aspects that come to shift public opinion on the ground with regards to who's going to be president. Now, there's a lot of chatter, and obviously this doesn't hold any weight, but the fact that people on the ground in the Arab world see a very big difference in the sense that whatever happens in US policy will affect what happens on the ground in the Arab world. That is why they are very in tune specifically to this very election, because of the fact that it's razor thin, is that whatever happens will affect them on the ground there. That being the Lebanese people in Lebanon, that being the Palestinians, that being the Egyptians, the North Africans and whatnot. So among the leadership level, we haven't heard anything in terms of preference to whichever candidate comes through. But at the same time, we cannot dismiss the fact that any incoming president will have a lot to clean up with regards to whatever's and everything that's happening on the ground. So it's a very toss-up kind of situation. There's a lot of tension and stress specifically what's going on in Lebanon. I know a lot of Lebanese people are essentially just waiting for the election day to come so that they can all exhale to see, okay, what's the policy that's going to come in hand. Everyone's just waiting for election day just to figure out, because whenever election day comes in, that's when everyone's going to be like, okay, now we can finally stop this election game campaigning and we can actually get to solid, concrete policy that will affect what's going to happen, whether or not we're going to see an actual end to the conflict or we're going to see it even expand further. But everyone's on a tight, essentially just on a tight cliff waiting for this day to come, which...
So Tarek, what you're saying, and I don't know if others want to jump in on this, is despite years of people in America in the Middle East policy debates talking about the post-America world and how we're less of a factor over there, and despite what some people have described, the strategic hedging of some of America's partners when it comes to China and Russia, we're still a major factor, and people are very much with bated breath, wondering, A, who's going to win the election, and then B, what will that president do when it comes to their part of the world, right?
Definitely. And I don't know if anyone wants to add to this, but the US politics will always have an effect on the Middle East, no matter what. The oil is involved, weapons are involved, even pacts of aid are involved. There's a lot of aid that comes through, but there's a lot of essentially weapons sales, oil ties and whatnot. So on a whole, US politics will always have an effect within the region, and the region as in the constituents within the Arab world will always care about what goes on in US politics.
Before go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry.
I was just going to make a quick point, which is that in this case, I mean, Israel's ability to continue carrying out the war is directly tied to US support. You know, Netanyahu makes these sort of bombastic proclamations about I'm going to stand up to America, I'll do it without America. But other Israeli politicians have said quite directly they cannot continue carrying out the war without US support. I mean, these multi-billion-dollar weapons packages that go through, Israel's obviously the biggest recipient of US military aid. The US has stepped in a much more direct way with this more direct confrontation with Iran. So I think when we're talking about the conflict that's influencing people's votes and that people in the region are waiting to see who the president is going to be, I mean, Tarek Alar, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the central thing people are waiting to see is if someone like Kamala Harris would be willing to condition aid or cut off some weapons to Israel to try to get the wars to stop or force them to the table for some kind of ceasefire or temporary truce. So I think in this case, there is no post-America Middle East when we're talking about the current wars right now, because Israel's ability to carry out these wars and continue expanding is directly a result of US support.
Yeah. And I don't look at what foreign leaders say about us. I look at what they do. You're seeing a United States that has been polarized now for 8 years, that in the eyes of a lot of foreign leaders is weak. And you're seeing people that have been enemies of the United States forming coalitions like BRICS and other groups. Their voices are rising. And I don't see how that's good for the United States leadership, in this world. I think we're viewed as being much weaker than we were 8 years ago. And I think that is a factor in what's happening in the world around us.
Yeah, I agree. I've written a little bit about this, but this is a strategic vulnerability where particular Middle East policy issues, whether it was U.S. support for Israel, being cast as a red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat issue, or just simple engagement in the region, has actually been exploited in many ways by some of America's adversaries. I mean, just expressing my own view on all of this, it makes it much more complicated. And this is sort of a lead into some of the things I wanted to talk about as we move towards the end of the panel, is what we expect this political ferment, these complicated trends in the Arab American and Muslim American community, how much that might shape policy. Before I get to that, though, I want to ask the question, which was the flavor of the weekend and still overarches U.S. foreign policy. I didn't see much in the poll about all of this, but it's the question of Iran. And I'm curious if all of you could actually offer a view. We talked a bit about Lebanon and Israel's war against Hezbollah in Lebanon and how it's impacting the people there and the reverb effect in the Arab American community. I wonder if there's a general sense, if anyone has picked up concerns in the Arab American community about Iran, if there's a divergence of view about its role in the region. Tariq, you can talk about it from where you sit in the region itself, but maybe start with you, Yasmin. Has it come up at all, given that it is a big national security and foreign policy question? Harris called Iran America's greatest adversary in her 60 Minutes interview, but does it resonate or not so much compared to Gaza and the death and destruction in Lebanon?
I can only speak anecdotally. I didn't hear it come up across a number of interviews in Michigan just a week and a half ago. And I think a lot of that is just because the impact of the war is so direct right now, of people getting killed and displaced, that's front of mind more so than bigger overarching policy questions about Iran and the U.S. relationship with Iran and how the U.S. chooses to confront that. The only way I really heard it come up was, whether Israel was going to pull the U.S. into a more direct war with troops and more weapons if the confrontation with Iran were to expand beyond where it is right now.
Yeah, Ray, do you have any thoughts on that?
Other than the fact that I think historically, if your policy isn't great, the best thing to do is have a bad guy, a villain out there, and you point at the villain and you say, this villain is going to destroy us. This axis of evil. Iran has always been the bad guy. And whenever things don't go right in this country, we point at the bad guy. So it resonates, I think, with Americans that Iran is a threat to this country. But I'm not sure Arab and Muslim Americans really look at that and see it in the same context. I think when you talk about Iran, I think they don't see the threat the same way most Americans do. I think they view it much differently. And I think they're more concerned about what's happening in Gaza. But I will say, since the YouGov poll, we saw this war in Lebanon break out, and that expanded this into a much greater and broader region. The majority of Arabs in the United States are Lebanese who have been here 4, 5, and 6 generations. They've been dragged into this pain by this assault against this destructive attack against Lebanon. This is painful. I've talked to Lebanese Americans who I know very well. To see that has been horrible for them because it's gone beyond Hezbollah and it's gone beyond Iran. So I actually see the Arab and Muslim community leaning more in anger, rather than seeing a resolution coming from the United States.
Yeah, because they're human beings and they see the impact on their communities and circles and people who live over there. So we as policy analysts or maybe in the media have the luxury of thinking through all the complexities of Iran's support for Hezbollah and what Hezbollah has done to the Lebanese people. But people see the immediate effects and see that. I don't know, Laura, if you've seen in some of your poll or in other polling, just the Iran factor and how it's viewed over here.
Yeah, we did cover it actually in this poll. We did ask them if what the U.S. should do. Is it supposed to decrease its military presence in the Middle East? And it looks like 4 in 10 Arab Americans surveyed think that the US should decrease its military presence. And the rest were polarized between increasing the presence or keeping it at the current state. When it comes specifically to Iran influence in the region, there are 4 in 10 respondents support diplomacy and offering incentives, yet there is another 3 in 10 respondents that believe the US administration should resort to maximum diplomatic pressure along with increasing sanctions. So you see that there is, this polarization of Arab Americans. I mean, you see that diplomacy comes first, but there's some of them that would like to see more, sanctions and, tougher diplomacy.
Yeah, no, and this is all very interesting. I mean, to me, it points also to the need for leadership to actually have a clear voice. This connects with something Ray just said earlier about what the clear policy on Iran is. And from my own personal assessment, it's not an MEI view, is that we've not really had a clear Iran policy for many, many years. We've had some labels, we haven't had an approach, but we haven't really also worked closely with some of our close Middle East partners. Tariq, to you on this question before we get to the final big question I'm most interested in, is how the Iran question is viewed today, especially from the perspective of Riyadh and the Arab world, because I think it's quite different, compared to 10 years ago, my view, where there was much more hawkish views about Iran being expressed and even some concern and opposition to the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Now it's quite a different posture to see Arab leaders meeting quite regularly with Iranian leaders and talking about the need to de-escalate. And that's very much out of sync with what we see the program that Israel is currently on in the region. So how do you tie this all up in terms of the policy out there? And how do you see it?
Well, I see that a safer, calmer region is for the benefit of everyone in the region. You see there's dialogue across the board, people wanting to calm down everything, find diplomatic solutions to the conflicts embroiled within, because a safer region is a calmer region, and a calmer region makes as a benefit to everyone, not only in the Middle East, but to neighboring regions as well as the whole globe. So you see envoys shuttling between all countries. You see peacemakers having side deals in different different conferences to discuss things. We've seen the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia meeting with the new president of Iran. Again, this is all pushing for a calmer region is a better region, and a better region is essentially safer for everyone across the world.
And just to follow up, because you're out there, do you see a perception about the U.S.? I know Secretary Blinken was just out there on his 11th trip since the start of the war. Do you see, do leaders or the people see a clear approach coming from the United States on Iran when it comes to what they're trying to do in that part of the world?
It's kind of difficult to say, really, because you have, given that there's an incoming election, the election's coming up, and it could be a coin toss between who's coming in. Everyone's kind of holding their breath on what could happen. We've seen Trump back out of a huge nuclear deal with Iran last minute, which had reverberations across the region, while we've had Blinken kind of bouncing between everything, and Amos Hochstein coming in between Israel and Lebanon, but no real change happening. So it's kind of difficult to really assess whether or not Arabs have what kind of the view they have of the US currently with regards to their diplomacy with Iran. So I can't really say about that on the matter right now.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that perspective. I'm going to come to the last question, which I want all of you to answer, and maybe we'll go in this order. We'll go Laura, Ray, Yasmin, and then Tariq, and then I'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts. And it's the question I, as a policy analyst, because I treat my work, seriously in MEI in terms of whomever's elected, I want to offer my best level judgment of who can actually do a better job if we do our job in informing the American public and Arab world what they're doing. What we've discussed here for more than an hour, the different political trends, and they're quite complicated in the Arab American and a bit about the Muslim American community. We didn't cover all the topics. It seems like there's an extreme amount of diversity and many different voices, more activism and engagement, in part because of the issues that are going on in the region. And the central question is this: do these different political trends, in your view, does it add up to any sort of new type of coalition and support at a popular level that could then be translated into a different approach, either in the next administration or in how Congress sees things. I often cite as an example the college protests about the war in Gaza, which we've seen this spring. When they're high water mark, at that same time, you had a vote in Congress that essentially was a 4-1 vote in favor of additional military aid to Israel. And a lot of this activity and ferment, at least at this moment, has not, in my view, translated certainly into different approaches from the Biden team. But my central question is this: do you see sort of the generational change? Do you see, importantly, at the political advocacy level, enough of a coherent, unified vision coming from this community? Or do you see more of a dynamic that is just reflective of the broader political trends in America, where there's coalition destruction and fragmentation as opposed to coalition building? So over to you, Laura, first, and then Ray, Yasmin, and then we'll end with Tarek.
I'm going to speak based on the data I've seen. I'm not going to analyze anything I'm not good at. I mean, I've seen definitely some differences when it comes to generations. I mean, I can see that the young voters have different perspective of how things go. Obviously, when we asked them about if they took part in the demonstration, most of them did. While we looked at the older generation, majority haven't, at least based on our poll of Arab Americans. I mean, obviously, there are different perspectives, different issues for every one of them. But what we see is at the end of the day, for Arab Americans, they're Americans. So a lot of domestic issues are very important on their list. So you're talking about the economy comes really very, very important, cost of living. And there are issues that are discussed, I mean, domestically, like abortion and, the borders. I mean, these came up as well in the poll, and it was quite interesting that a lot of Arab Americans think that there are a lot of immigrants right now in the country. The controls should be tightened. So you can see that there are a lot of things that are in common with, the issues that are discussed right now in the, domestically in the US.
No, that's an important point. I should actually want to comment before we turn to Ray, is that about 24 years ago out of graduate school, I worked with a man named Stan Greenberg and James Carville at a political polling firm, and we worked for Al Gore and Joe Lieberman's campaign, and I was involved with the Latino American voters. And what you said about Arab American voters are American was what we heard, and also the views on immigration, especially amongst registered voters or those who were very motivated to vote, were actually not that dissimilar from the general population, right? And that's part of, I think, America and what happens when you come here, and even these complicated questions of how you code or categorize what is Arab American who do you include in your survey and things like that. And it's part of what I hope will remain the brilliant melting pot of America. Ray, how do you see things in terms of this question I'm most interested in? Do you see policy change coming as a result of these different new trends in political attitudes and advocacy in the Arab American community?
No, I mean, when you really look at it, there's no difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. Biden started out by saying he wanted partnership with Arab Americans. That flopped. It just vanished. We didn't hear much about that since it was unveiled. He appointed 24 Arab Americans to different positions in the White House and the State Department. They were pretty much muzzled. They weren't allowed to do interviews. Harris, in taking over, all her meetings with the Arab community have been behind closed doors. She didn't come to the ADC convention that had 1,000 people, that I covered, and she didn't come there and address the community back then. People aren't taking us seriously. So I think that there's a sense in the Arab and Muslim community that there could be a tipping point where they actually make a difference. And while not everybody is in love with Stein, it's about the opportunity to tell Democrats, stop taking us for granted. I think that's the biggest message in this election. Stop taking us for granted. You're no different than Trump. You just do it with a smile. Trump does it with a frown. What's the difference when the policy is the same on Palestine or Lebanon? Why is there violence in Lebanon today? Why is Israel being allowed to attack Lebanon? if the Democrats are different than the Republicans, why aren't they stopping it? So the truth is they're not different. So I think that voters in the Arab and Muslim community believe that there is a chance that things might change in this election because all the factors have come together for them to give them that opportunity. Whether it happens or not, I'm not sure, but I think there's a better chance today than there has been in the past to make a change.
Thanks, Ray. Yasmin, you mentioned earlier that the factor of U.S. arms sales and security cooperation with Israel and how this is a key debate. And it's something even I've seen from your reporting and your colleagues as well, the discussion inside of the Biden administration. They haven't really used that as a policy tool, as far as I can tell, in a big way. But do you see on this question of things changing down the line in 2025, 2026, as a result of this new political activism coming from Arab Americans, Muslim Americans? And if so, what direction does it head?
Well, obviously, it depends on who wins. But I do think if you saw a Harris presidency, it's not going to be the dramatic change that people are pushing for. But I do think there are signs that the Democratic Party is shifting on Israel in subtle but important ways. I think at the start of the war, first of all, we've never seen the issue of Palestine be this big of a political issue for this long. I think in the Biden administration, there was a sense that people would be really angry and protest for a month or two. They hoped the war would be over by January, but they never anticipated. I mean, they were always wildly optimistic that this was not going to hang over them as an election issue. And here we are more than a year later, and it's still a key driver of the election. So I think that's an important signal of how much the politics have shifted on this. I don't think we've seen this before in US politics, where the debate has been this intense and this sustained. And then I think you've seen important shifts in the Democratic Party over the course of the year. So I remember towards the end of 2023, about half of Democratic senators had indicated support for a measure that would impose some conditions on aid to Israel. And then the Biden administration made an agreement with the Hill to sort of avoid this split vote. But that was a big shift that you saw I think about 20 or 22 Democratic senators were willing to sign on or had signed on to a measure that would start to condition aid to Israel. And then I think with this big generational shift, I've reported about how if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, the first thing she would probably do is undertake a big review of US Israel policy, determine what's working and what's not working. I don't think we're entering a world where she would all of a sudden cut off offensive weapons or even condition aid in a big dramatic way. She might show a willingness to suspend certain weapons shipments or send certain signals to Israel. So these are going to be, subtle, but I think important changes that could come if she were to win because of the pressure that she's been facing from the Arab American and Muslim community and also from progressive Democrats. I mean, I think it's important to note that these positions obviously are most important for Arab Americans and Muslims, but this is not the only community that feels this way, especially in the Democratic Party. I think if Donald Trump wins, we sort of know what his position on Israel is. The Republican Party is not where the Democratic Party is in terms of wanting to change policy on Israel. So that's a very different picture. But I've reported extensively on what a Harris administration might do. And her aides and allies at least say that she will take a different approach from Joe Biden. Whether she does it when push comes to shove and you have to face the politics of that is a different question, but that's what they're saying right now.
Great. Thanks, Yasmin. Tarek, next to the last word for you, because I get the last word when I wrap it up. You're on mute, my friend. I keep on doing it 5 years later.
I'll keep it very tight. In our coverage of the poll, essentially, our editor-in-chief wrote a very telling quote, which is that Las Vegas rules really don't apply to the Middle East. So whoever the new president is, they need to act fast on both Iran and Israel. And they do have a lot of regional allies, but it does take two to tango. So whatever the region is going through, they really do have to act fast on that to calm it down.
Great. Well, I'm going to land this plane on time and essentially say one thing in conclusion before I thank all of you. I do think that the tone and tenor of this discussion, the one we just had, but then the political discussion we're having in this country, it does imply that there's actually a strong interest in the United States engaging more deeply in the Middle East, just doing it in the right way. There's a serious difference over who and which candidate would actually present that right way. But for those who have said that we should just pull back from the region, restrain ourselves, I mean, there's some who say that. But I think there's a general impulse here that we need to actually delve more deeply into trying to solve these, or not solve, but engage these questions in a proper way in the region itself, but then politically here at home. And that's our mission here at the Middle East Institute, is to try to engage in the complexities of what's going on mostly in the region. But I want to thank all four of you, Laura, Ray, Yasmin, Tarek, for what I found a very fascinating discussion. I'm sure our audience has, because we're still getting questions as we're trying to wrap up this question or this session in. And I really value your expertise and the time that you shared with us today. Thank you for tuning in for our audience out there. Please check out all of our work at www.mei.edu. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.